I'm Chris Ray, and I'm a research biologist. I work here at the University of Colorado. My work is funded by grants, so I'm on soft money. I have been focusing on issues related to conservation biology for my entire career. And in particular, I'm interested in how populations survive and how they maintain genetic diversity when we remove or alter their habitat. So mainly what we're doing is humans come in and we fragment the landscape. We develop parts of it and we leave little patches where animals and plants can still live. And I try to figure out how that patchiness affects population dynamics, we call it. So how populations grow and shrink and how they maintain genetic diversity or lose genetic diversity. In general, we hear about problems that are associated with mountain species. So one of the big things lately is, well, there's been pine beetle problems, and they're mainly in the pines that are in the mountains. And part of that is because global climate change is affecting mountains before some of the other areas, mountain climates before some of the other areas. However, right here in Colorado, it's not clear that we are having extreme climate change yet. There are many places in the mountain west that are experiencing climate changes, but right here, especially in the Front Range of Colorado, around Boulder, it's not clear that there have been large climatic changes. Still, there have been some big changes, for example, the mountain pine beetle coming in, that make people, that raise people's concern for climate change. But pine beetles came in the 70s as well, and they came in before that. So it's not really clear yet whether there are climate issues here. I would make a guess that mountain species would be most affected in the early stages of climate change. So that would be any of the plants and animals living in the mountains. They're being affected by not only climate change, but changes in rates of introduction of chemicals from the atmosphere. So things like nitrogen. So cows out on the plains fart, and the nitrogen goes up into the mountains and it comes down into the meadows. And it's very possible that the plants are being affected by this extra nitrogen deposition. So the mountains are experiencing several impacts, and so mountain species are most likely. I don't know a huge amount about other species, and I don't have personally projections about other species that might be affected by climate change. Like I said, most of my focus has been on the patchiness of habitat and how that affects plants and animals. So I started studying pikas because they are restricted to a very patchy habitat. You don't find pikas off of basically rock slides or jumbles of broken rock. We call it talus. And talus is very patchy. You only find it usually in the mountains. Right underneath a cliff you might find a patch of talus. And pikas somehow have to find that patch themselves, and then they have to survive on it. And you never see huge amounts of talus. It's always in small patches and often quite far apart. So I started studying pikas to understand how this little thing that can't move all that far manages to survive despite the fact that its habitat is patchy, because it seemed like a good model system for other species that are having to deal with this kind of habitat fragmentation because of human changes to the environment. And it turns out pikas recently have been disappearing from a lot of the patches that they used to be on. So I have shifted my focus in my own personal research to try to understand, well, what's happening to these pikas? Why are they disappearing from some of these patches? And so far, we can't come up with any explanations that don't seem to have at the root of them climate change. Pikas are interesting because they're only about as big as your fist, and they're related to rabbits, so they have a really thick fur. Because they're related to rabbits, just like rabbits, they don't hibernate. So they're not rodents. Rodents are things like rats and squirrels and beavers. All of those things tend to hibernate to some degree over the winter. Rabbits don't. Rabbits, hares, and pikas do not. So imagine this poor little thing. It's about this big, and it's up in the mountains all winter, experiencing that incredible cold, and it can't hibernate. So it can't let its body temperature go down. It has to maintain a high body temperature and be awake all winter. Well, it loses heat really, really fast. Things that lose heat really, really fast have to have a really high metabolic rate to make up for it. They're taking in food, they're making a lot of energy and heat to make up for this heat loss. In the winter, that's great. Pikas do fairly well. They survive over the winter, obviously. They're all over the West. But in the summer, that really gets them in trouble, because in the summertime, their metabolic rate is also high, and they're operating at really high heat. And if it's hot outside, they're operating close to what we call a thermal maximum. Their body temperature is almost lethal. If it raises just a couple degrees, it can be lethal to them. So, pikas may be susceptible to global warming because summers are warmer. Maybe they're dying more in the summertime. Or maybe they just can't run around as much as they need to in the summertime. So pikas, because they don't hibernate, they have to make hay while the sun shines. So in the summertime, they're racing out from their homes, gathering grasses and flowers, racing back, and making this hay pile. Each pika makes its own hay pile, and this hay pile has to last it all winter. So pikas can make hundreds of trips a day during the summer to collect this vegetation, make this hay pile. Well, if they're too hot, you know how it is, when you're too hot you want to get up and run around, they might not be able to collect enough vegetation over the summer to make it over the winter. There are many ways that climate change could affect pikas. This direct heat exhaustion or actually heat-related mortality could be one of them. We don't know that, however. There are other ways. One of my favorite hypotheses is that, as you might have heard, because of global warming, a lot of the mountains don't have as much snow over the winter as they used to have. So they have a lower snowpack, thinner snowpack. Sometimes the snow melts off completely in the middle of the winter. Well, just because there's less snow doesn't mean it's warmer. Sometimes there's a cold day. Every once in a while there's a cold snap. Even with global warming, there are going to be extreme cold snaps. And if there's no snow, but there's a cold snap, pikas can get really cold. Snow acts as an insulating blanket, and the pikas are underneath it all winter. And if the blanket's thinner, they can die of freezing. So the ironic thing is that with global warming, pikas might be freezing to death over the winter. And that's something that I think might be happening in some of these places where we've lost pikas. The reason I think that is that when you actually look at the relationship between where pikas are and where pikas aren't and the climate, the thing about climate that explains where they are and where they aren't tends to be how cold the winter was. Places where the winter was colder, we've lost more pikas. Individual pikas, when they're born, they tend to want to settle close to their parents. And they try to settle close to their parents. They tend to get chased out. But they don't go much further than they have to go. And once they find a territory, they stay there for life. An individual pika finds a nice pile of rocks, and it learns it really well, and it doesn't move from there. So the way pikas are moving is basically we're losing them from some areas. They're dying more from those areas, or they're not reproducing in those areas, and we lose the whole population. If there's a mountain like this, where pikas are distributed from the top down to here, what's been happening over the last 100 years is that this lower limit to the population has been moving uphill. This is what's happening out in the Great Basin, the area between the Sierra Nevada and the Rocky Mountains. We're losing populations from the lower elevations so that pikas are effectively moving up the mountainside. It doesn't mean that individuals are moving at all. They can't respond that way. They're just being lost from these lower elevations through death or lack of reproduction. I don't know of any other examples right now of species where it's been as well documented, whether or not they're moving uphill, or their distribution is moving uphill, I should say. One of the best known examples, however, are instances of different species of butterflies all throughout the West and actually all throughout the U.S. Butterflies have been shifting their ranges, not necessarily always uphill, but north or south. So butterflies have been shifting north that used to be found further south. The trouble is when you have a species that is living in the mountains, and you have a mountain peak like this, it can't shift north without shifting off the mountain and down into a valley before it gets to the next mountain. And so mountain species are more likely to go extinct if they're forced uphill or if they're forced north, because they're moving into smaller amounts of habitat near a peak of a mountain, and they can't move north without going through a valley, and if they're not a valley species, they can't do that. Pikas are a particularly good example of what will happen to mountain species with global climate change. Some of the species that live on mountains are much more vagile. They're able to move much further than pikas, like, say, bighorn sheep. A bighorn sheep can, from one mountain peak, see another one and actually go there. A pika can't do that. So they're going to be limited the way plants are limited, or other things that can't move so well. Not a lot is known yet about range shifts in plants, especially with respect to global warming. I suspect that it may be happening, but the pika eats anything that grows. Like almost any rabbit you run into, anything green or orange or whatever, it's going to eat. And so it's not necessarily a problem for pikas that the vegetation may be changing. It may be a problem, however, and we are studying it. One of the things I'm particularly concerned about, though, is how much water is in the vegetation. So a particular plant that pikas like may be growing in a certain place this year, and it may be growing there next year, but the amount of water in that plant may be greatly reduced as the climate changes. And pikas get most of their water from what they eat. And if the vegetation isn't as lush as it used to be, doesn't contain as much moisture, that may introduce a very strong stress on pikas. Yeah, there are many species that get a lot of their water from what they eat. The larger ungulates, you're used to ungulates. The larger species like deer and bighorn sheep, you're used to seeing pictures of them drinking from streams, and they do get some of their water that way. A lot of the smaller species, however, get water from the plants that they eat because they can't necessarily travel long distances to go to streams to drink. Big animals like deer and bighorn sheep, they can travel long distances to find water and drink from water sources like streams and ponds. But smaller animals like pikas and voles and things like that, they don't travel very far. They can't necessarily go and just drink from pools. So they get most of their water from the plants that they eat. And if those plants contain less water as the climate warms, those animals could be in real trouble. Well, all the small animals like pikas and voles and mice and shrews and all these things, they form the bottom of the food chain in the mountains. And so if you don't have the prey, you can't have the predators. And very often people are going to the mountains to see the really bigger things, They want to know that there's foxes out there. They want to know that there's coyotes and wolves and eagles and all of those things that prey on these small mammals. And as you reduce the small mammal prey base, everything suffers. I've been studying pikas now for 20 years, and they're disappearing from a lot of the places where they used to be. They're disappearing very fast, much faster than they should be disappearing. If they were disappearing at this rate for the last 20,000 years, they would have been gone a long, long time ago. And they've been out there for 20,000 years, and all of a sudden they're disappearing. What's happening? What I see is they're moving up the mountain, their distribution's shrinking and shrinking, and it's going up so fast. It's going up over 10 meters per year. Well, it turns out we don't have 1,000 meters left for them to the top of the mountain in most places, which means they'll be gone. If they continue moving up the mountain at more than 10 meters a year, they'll be gone in less than 100 years. They might be gone in 50 from many places. My son, who's just turning 1 in a week, won't know pikas. And if pikas are doing that, a lot of other species could be doing that. And I just hate to see the loss of diversity that might be coming as we warm the planet. Well, I'd really like to see us address climate change. We have no idea how it might be directly affecting pikas. We're studying that intensively right now. It looks like, however, pikas are responding to some aspect of climate change. And I would really like us to turn this around, turn this ship around. I think we all need to be, living closer to being off the grid or net zero energy. I'm living off the grid right now. It's tough, but it's not impossible. I'm still carrying out my research, still doing my life, still raising my son. So I think that we could all do something. I happen to live at 9,000 feet in the Rockies, and I live in a little cabin. It has 2 solar panels. And yeah, sometimes we run out of power, but it's all character building, and it's difficult raising a son under those conditions. Don't have the kind of power that I need to necessarily work at home when I need to work at home. Sometimes I have to drive to town, which is terrible because then I'm using fossil fuels. But for the most part, it's working out. There are so many routes that global warming or climate change could affect a species, and I've only talked about 2: direct heat, heat stress, and cold stress. But we've also heard that global warming is often changing the distribution of diseases that animals can get and plants can get. It's caused the extinction of something like 77% of the cloud forest frog species, harlequin frogs. It's ridiculous so that what's happening there is there's a chytrid fungus that comes in and kills these frogs. Well, pikas suffer from diseases too. We don't know anything about what diseases they're facing. But as the climate changes, they could be dying from plague for all I know. So there are just so many routes that climate change could affect plants and animals. We just really need to be studying it and figuring out what's happening out there so that we can manage for it or get inspired to turn things around.